So a very warm Marine Corps round of applause for Jim Moriarty.
Now, you guys know I'm a trial lawyer, right? I get paid by the word. You probably ought to order some more beer. This may take a while. I'm sure I'm not the only parent who's lost a son or daughter in war. Any other Gold Star parents in here? Anybody? I can tell you it sucks. I planned one speech, but I'm going to tell another now that I've heard what he would like to hear. It's November 4th. My son's on his third deployment in Jordan, and he was safe. Jordan's one of our chief allies, and I never went to bed and lost any sleep whatsoever worried about my son. He was a consummate professional, Staff Sergeant in the United States Army, Special Forces, and he was a stud. I would have hoped that he would have gone in the Marine Corps, and he actually went down and applied to get in the Marine Corps, and they asked him who his mother was, and they asked him who his father was, and he knew both, so they wouldn't take him. So as sort of a consolation prize, he goes into the Army, and frankly, I bitterly opposed that. Jimmy had a dad bod. He was a fraternity boy. He grew up as a little rich white kid, and I'm thinking they're going to eat him for breakfast. And I failed to give him credit for being the extraordinary young man he was. But he was a superb and a consummate soldier. Susan and I were out at a business meeting, and I hear on NPR that 3 soldiers had been shot, 1 killed in Jordan. And it was like somebody had driven a silver stake through my heart. I knew that we had about 1,000 people in Jordan, but they were describing someone exactly like my son. I called his older sister, and I said, you need to call Jimbo right now and make sure he's safe. And she said, Dad, it's the middle of the night. And I said, I don't give a shit if it's the middle of the night. Call him and wake his ass up. I want to know he's safe. And she did, but they locked down communications when there's the death. So we couldn't get through to him. And then I reasoned through, because I knew that they would send Army people out to the house. I reasoned through, the longer that we go without hearing anything, the better. And statistically, we should have been in pretty good shape. Three out of 1,000. Well, I went to bed early that night, and I prayed that I would sleep that night soundly. 9:30 or 10 o'clock, the phone rings. My daughter, who's in Columbia, calls and says, Dad, it was Jim. And I stayed up all night crying and looking at pictures of my son. When the Army guys showed up, I said, I got 2 questions. Who killed him and why? Because I wanted to square accounts. They didn't know. They had no idea. So I go get on Google, and I check and I read, and the New York Times has run a piece on it. And they say that there were mistakes made at the gate. And I said to myself, that's horse shit. Now that's a technical legal term for those of y'all who've never heard that phrase before. We use it all the time, especially with judges. I know my son. My son was like all of these kids in Special Forces and Recon and Special Ops. They are our finest children. They are the finest young people in our country, and they have extraordinary training. And I knew that there weren't any mistakes made at the gate. So I tracked down, and I've sort of went into my typical trial lawyer mode. I was going to square accounts. And so I tracked down Peter Baker, who was the New York Times reporter in Jerusalem, and I called him and I said, Peter, that story's bullshit. My son did not run the gate. There weren't mistakes made at the gate. He was murdered by someone, and we need to find out who it was, and we need to find out why they did it. So he wrote another story, and that changed a little bit. And now the Jordanians claim that their first lie was there was mistakes made at the gate. The second lie, the Jordanians are so-called allies that we give $1.5 billion a year to of our taxpayers' money. The second lie the Jordanians came up with was they were drinking. Well, that was horse shit. It was noontime. They were out. They were doing this CIA program where they were training these so-called Syrian rebels. They were going to Eastern Europe and buying communist bloc weapons, bringing that stuff into Jordan, where they were training these so-called Syrian rebels. Now, just ask yourself, has anybody ever seen any other instances in our lifetime when we've trained these young Muslim males how to fight and given them weapons and seen how that turned out? Well, it's turning out the same way in Syria. So the narrative changed a little bit, and then 2 weeks later, there's a Washington Post story that comes out, and this time the Jordanians are claiming there's an accidental discharge. Well, I don't want to embarrass myself in front of you guys, but I'm a gun nut, okay? People say if you got too much ammo, my answer is if you haven't run out, you damn sure don't have too much. With all due respect, my son had fired more rounds before he ever went into the Army than most people fire when they're out of the Army. There was no accidental discharge. I knew to a certainty that wasn't true. And now I find out that the FBI is pushing back on them because they had gone over and done an inspection, inspected the vehicle. So I call that reporter, and I track that reporter down, and I get the story straight then. Then I discovered that there's a video of the shootout. Objective evidence of what really happened. Well, they wouldn't show us the video then. He was killed in early November, and he was buried at Arlington in December. But it's the end of February before we see the video. And we go to Washington, and we get a briefing by the FBI and the Army, and I see the video, and I'm madder than a wet hen. They assassinated Brian McEnroe's son, Kevin, and they assassinated Matt Llewellyn. You can go watch the video. I forced the King of Jordan to release the friggin' video. You can watch the video, and they assassinated those two boys, and then they spent the next 5 minutes stalking my son and the survivor. And my son and the survivor fought back brilliantly. Well, nobody's going to kill my son and get away with it. I would track them down to the end of the earth and kill them myself if I could. So I go up and I see this FBI briefing. I see this video, and I'm outraged after I see the video. I promptly set a press conference at the National Press Club for the next week where I was going to release the Army report, and I was going to put significant heat on Jordan, and I did. So Ted Poe, and I hope many of you know and respect who Ted Poe was. Ted Poe had called me. We had been friends for decades, and he said, "What can I do?" And I said, "You can make those son of bitches apologize for murdering our boys."
3 Green Berets from the 5th Special Forces Group were killed in support of Operation Inherent Resolve. One of those heroic men was 27-year-old Staff Sergeant James Jimmy Moriarty. To be clear, neither the family nor myself are satisfied that we have received all the facts about the death of those 3 Green Berets.
So he calls the ambassador from Jordan, and the ambassador from Jordan writes a letter. Now again, this is a technical legal term and one that you probably never heard before, a chicken shit letter claiming that mistakes were made, Sometimes things happen in war, and it was the most mealy-mouthed excuse for the murder of 3 Americans I've ever seen, and that made me even madder. So I hold this press conference, this letter comes out, and I'm blasting Jordan and this ambassador at this press conference. Well, Trump was having a urinating contest with the CIA that day, so we got no television coverage, but several print reporters did good stories, and they came out, and for the first time, the narrative of what really happened began to be told. Ted calls me, and about this time, the King of Jordan comes over with his hand out wanting more of our taxpayer money, and Trump meets with him. And now I will say this, and I will give great credit to General Dunford, General Mattis. Dunford's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I insisted that I wanted to know how high in our government has somebody seen this video. And I wanted Trump to see the video. They said, well, we don't know. But I said, well, you need to find out. So they went over, and an Army general personally showed that video to Mattis, and Mattis was pissed. And so now we got our highest level officials in the military saying, why are you murdering our soldiers? So then, the Poe calls me and says, well, the king's going to write a letter saying he's sorry. And I said, well, fine. And so they write this letter, and I've got my own sources in the agency and my own sources in special forces. Those people are extraordinary, even if they can't be Marines. And so I knew what the letter was going to say before the letter came around. And so Congressman Poe says, well, they've got this letter from the king, and they want me to deliver it. And I said, don't you dare deliver that letter. He said, what do I tell him? I said, you tell that, I won't use the phrase, blankety blank ambassador to get her ass on an airplane, and she can fly her ass to Missouri, and she can meet with that family and say she's sorry, and she can fly down and she can meet with my family and say she's sorry, and she can fly down to Florida and meet with Brian's family and tell him she's sorry. Well, it was another mealy-mouthed letter. And so a couple of the people videoed it. Those videos are on YouTube. We're all still madder than wet hens. Not only did they assassinate our boys, but they lied about it, and they lied about it, and they lied about it, and they lied about it. Well, here's where the press comes in. And let me say this. I've looked around the place, and I've figured out I'm the only Democrat here. Here's what the press does. And let me say, in my view, one of the great institutions of our life, besides the military that still works, is some of the press. Now, I personally sued CNN and AOL Time Warner. I took Peter Arnett's deposition, and he's a lying bastard, if that comes as a surprise to any of you that served in Vietnam. But there's a part of the press that works. There's a great deal of the press that works very well. I had worked for the mayor in Houston for 7 or 8 years. Andrea White's a friend of mine. So I wrote an op-ed piece for the Houston Chronicle. She shares that with a famous Houston Chronicle reporter named Joe Hawley. Joe Hawley shares it with his son, who's a Washington Post reporter. And so I get a call from Peter Hawley, the Washington Post, and he wants to write a story about Jimbo, which would really be what I'd call a puff piece. Now, my son was an extraordinary kid, but the story was going to be Jimmy Moriarty's really good kid. He was a really good kid, but they were going to do this story. He calls the Jordanian ambassador. She gets into a panic because they can't get embarrassed in D.C. because if we do, we'll cut off their allowance. So the Jordanian ambassador now writes a letter and says, oh, we just discovered our guy was acting outside the rules of engagement, and we're going to criminally prosecute him. So I'm going, okay, that's a good start. So 2 or 3 weeks later, they start the trial, and I go to the trial. I've called the FBI, and I said, I want to know what's going on, and I want to know what kind of support we're going to get. And they give me mealy-mouthed bureaucratic excuses, and I said, let me explain to you how it is. My ass is going to be on an airplane going to Jordan. If I don't get a call from you by noon tomorrow and 5 o'clock that night, my ass was on an airplane flying to Jordan. Now, I figure they're going to do one of two things. They're going to kill me or they're going to roll out a red carpet. You know, we never die but once, so, you know, shit happens. So I get there and they roll out a red carpet. Now, I'm going on, I'm probably going to beat the 35-minute record. I didn't really mean to do this. I get there and they roll out the red carpet, and our State Department people and the FBI said, we don't have a First Amendment right of free speech over here. They'll put you in jail for bad-mouthing the king. They do put people in jail for bad-mouthing the king. The trial's secret and you can't talk about it. And I say to myself, they've never met a Marine. So I go back, and I'm in the judge's chambers. The judge's chambers is about as big as this area up here, and he's sitting up here, and there's a bunch of junior officers over here, and there's State Department people here, and we're sitting over here. And I figure out who the reporter is. There's an AP reporter, and I'd been talking to him. So I go over, and I'm literally being interviewed by this AP reporter in the judge's chambers in this freaking secret trial. Like I'm gonna honor that. And they figure out what I'm doing, and they just pop a cork. And I'm thinking, well, I probably am going to jail. But again, that wasn't gonna slow me down. They've run the reporter out. She goes out in the chambers, and I said, okay, when we finish up today, come back to the hotel. Here's where I'm staying. Bring your camera crew, because I'm gonna do an interview, and we're gonna put this shit on television.
It just never quits. It never goes away. I like to think of myself as tough and stoic, but I can listen to Brian and break out in tears.
So there wasn't any more secret trial after that. There wasn't any more sealed evidence. There wasn't anything we could talk about. And this young man did not go to jail for bad-mouthing the king. I saved some of that for when I came back. I will tell you, and I want to make you guys proud for what I did as a Marine. I will tell you that I love these Special Forces guys that my son served with. They are absolutely remarkable, and they have been faithful and true and supportive of me and my family, and I love them with a passion. I figured out that the Jordanian Air Force was paying for the hotel and the meal and the bar bill. So I put out a call to 5th Special Forces, and I said, I want every swinging you-know-what to come to the hotel tonight. The liquor's on me, and I ran up a $750 bar bill. It got stuck. I wasn't sure I was going to tell you that because I was afraid if I admitted to you that I ran up a $750 bar bill for a bunch of Army weenies, you'd think less of me, but it's the truth, so that's what happened. I want to close on where I wanted to go with this talk. I was not prepared to have my son die at war. He was in Jordan. I never lost a night's sleep, and I was completely unprepared for what happened, and I was in serious shock after it happened. The support of the United States Army, the support of our government, the support of the press, the support of everybody in America has been absolutely remarkable. And I will tell you, I will not live long enough to say thank you for everybody that has done things for my family and done things to honor my son. They routinely bring me to tears. I was in tears when Michael called. I'll tell you about one little story, and then we're going to go back to drinking. There's a guy named Ken Pridgeon down in Baytown. He's like 86 years old, and he's got like a couple of grand a month that he gets from Social Security, and that's what he lives on. And he's a brilliant painter. He has painted paintings, you know what I'm talking about. He's painted paintings of hundreds of our wounded or our dead soldiers and sailors, Marines, and Air Force. He painted one for Jimmy, and he painted one for Matt and for Kevin. He called me down and asked me to come down because they were, television was going to do a story on Budweiser that had saved all of the paintings in his shop, and so I went down there for that. I can't tell you what it meant to me as a father that someone would honor my son, not for money, not for recognition, but just to do something for my family that fine and ask for nothing in return. Ken Pridgeon is an American hero. I can't tell you how much that meant to me, and I hope all of you will go on Facebook and look him up and say something to him. Now, I will tell you this. I did do what any Marine would do. I was invited to the White House, and I was at the White House 2 weeks ago when the President awarded the Medal of Honor to Gary Michael Rose, who was one of the guys on Operation Tailwind, where that case where I'd sued AOL, Time Warner, and CNN, and Peter Arnett. So they awarded Rose the Medal of Honor. And I mentioned this to Ken when I was down in his shop, because he had these paintings of these Medal of Honor winners, and I said, well, you ought to do one for Mike Rose. And he talked about how incredible it was that he got to meet these people. I said, well, speaking about meeting these people, how would you like to go to the White House? And he thought I was kidding. And I said, how would you like to go to the White House? How would you like to be there when the President awards Mike Rose the Medal of Honor? And he said, well, I'd be absolutely thrilled to death. Well, there were 2 more people that we could add to the list, so I added him and I added his cohort in crime. Then he called me the next day and said, I can't go. And I said, why can't you go? And he said, because I can't afford it. I don't have any money. And I said, what do you need? And he says, I need a place to stay at a hotel and an airline ticket. I said, okay, I'll call you back in 10 minutes. So I called the Special Forces Association, who's been absolutely as good as gold. Special Forces Association paid for his way to Washington. We can't do enough for those people who honor our children and who protect our children. But I figured y'all would expect that of me because I'm a Marine. Thank you very much for your time.